The Ways of Mental Prayer, Part 10. Chapter 3. Passive Purifications. These are the passive purification of the senses, and that of the spirit. The former is rather common, seeing that it is the ordinary introduction to mystical contemplation. The latter is very rare. Article 1. Passive Purification of the Senses. Part 1. Notion of this state. The passive purification of the senses is not any kind of suffering, such as aridities, temptations, humiliations, scruples, cares, sickness, and the thousand other trials which bound in the spiritual life. It is an habitual and a very special dryness, by its very nature related to mystical prayer, of which it is the preparation, the germ, and the bud. To rather it is itself contemplation, but as yet too feeble, dry, full of desolation and purgative. It is passive. God it is who is operating, and the soul yields herself up to his operations. It purges the senses by subjecting them to the spirit, and by fettering the sensible faculties of their natural functions. Thus these faculties enter, as it were, into an obscure night, for which reason St. John of the Cross calls this state the night of the senses. This is the first night. Another night still more painful succeeds this, namely, that of the spirit. The concurrence of the following three signs characterizes the former night. 1. The first is a total dryness of the sensible faculties. When a man finds no comfort nor pleasure in the things of God, and neither also in created things, it is God who produces this universal loathing in the soul in order to annihilate and purge away its sensitive desires. He had carried the soul in his arms, had nourished her with the milk of sensible consolations, encouraged her by his caresses. Now that she has grown in grace, he weans her and places her upon the ground, that she may learn to walk. Hence comes that aridity in prayer. God no longer smiles, the heart is devoid of all enthusiasm, the imagination no longer helps at all, but impedes her by its distractions. All is gloomy desert and desolation. Weariness weighs her down in the practice of virtue. The soul is plunged into bitterness. Sacrifice terrifies. A mere nothing makes her suffer. Temptation is more than ever burdensome. She feels a distaste for all created things. She experiences no liking for anything. She cannot find sweetness or comfort anywhere. On the other hand, she would not cherish any attraction for anything that is not God. For although the sensible faculties are cast down, dulled, and weakened, the spirit remains lively and strong. It is true that it appears to be without strength, being no longer sustained by the sensible faculties, and has also its only too real weakness, as the life of Saint Teresa, during her 18 years of trial, superabundantly demonstrates. Still, in spite of all this, the soul desires only God, seeks him with anxiety, and suffers bitterly on account of being weaned from him. This aridity is an inflection which lasts for months and sometimes even for years. 2. The second sign is more characteristic. It is the powerlessness and vacuity of the mind, which is, as it were, bound down hand and foot when engaged in prayer. In all other functions, to study, for instance, or to reflect on its ordinary business, the soul can freely use its mental powers. But in prayer, notwithstanding all her efforts, the imagination remains inert, the memory without any distinct recollections, the understanding empty of ideas. The soul is no longer able to consider the numerous details of a mystery, to study a truth and draw conclusions and excite affections by it. Briefly, considerations become as it were impossible, or at least perseverance in making them is an impossibility, though this powerlessness is less marked when meditation is made while writing down one's thoughts. Sometimes the mind is so empty that even a book is of no service. It is read but not understood. Vocal prayers are difficult and tend to become a torment. A man in this state cannot meditate, but he can think on God, keep the eye of his soul fixed on him after a simple, general, and confused fashion, by an affectionate look without any scaffolding of considerations or too complicated details. It is only by slow degrees that the power to meditate disappears and a simple look becomes the only prayer possible. This powerlessness augments progressively and tends to become more and more profound. It may be subject to intermissions, especially in the beginning. There is then a kind of intermediate state, during which, at one time, the soul has nothing to do but to receive infused contemplation. At another, she must correspond by a tranquil, moderate exercise of the understanding with the grace which wants to lead her into it. Is there any need to add that the will, by this emptiness of the mind, is reduced to turn herself towards God by a vague and indistinct love, or to make only short acts, and that she enters into this dryness, unless, indeed, it pleases God to console her without, however, restoring to the intellect its power of reasoning on spiritual things. Such is the doctrine taught by St. John of the Cross, and confirmed by experience. St. Teresa ceases not to repeat that she suffered much during a number of years from this inability to meditate. Afterwards, it was very seldom that she could reason with her understanding, because her soul used to enter immediately into recollection, quiet, or rapture. She teaches that, generally speaking, souls, after being elevated to perfect contemplation, can no longer meditate as before. This is, at bottom, the teaching of St. John of the Cross, though not quite so strongly accentuated. According to her, also, our Lord sends the pains of prayer, to some from the very beginning, to others at the end. She herself had not experienced them, when she first began to enjoy the prayer of quiet and of union at about the age of 20 years. It was necessary to call attention to these slight differences. 3. In the third place, the most certain sign of this state is when the soul delights to be alone, waiting lovingly on God, in interior peace, quiet, and repose, without any particular considerations, without acts and efforts of the intellect, memory, and will, at least in a discursive way, that is, without passing by consideration from one subject to another. The soul is, therefore, set towards God. In the midst of its desolation, it has no wish for creatures. It wants God. It does not rejoice in his presence, yet has no pleasure but there. In spite of its aridities and repugnances, it thirsts after solitude. The omission of prayer would produce remorse and create a frightful void. It wants everything when it has God. The mind is turned towards God by only a simple, vague, confused thought, by a general and unvarying remembrance of him. God is not represented to the soul under any form. No words can convey the idea which she forms of him. He is not conceived precisely as great, nor as beautiful, nor as good, nor as powerful. Her idea of him is not this, and yet it is all this, or, better still, it is something above all this. God, God, God is the only word which the soul can utter to express her thoughts about him. Evidently the intellect is here not much engaged. 1,000 distractions beset it. But the distractions once passed away, the occupations once ended, if we want to think of God, it is always the same simple and general thought that recurs to the mind, and we can find no other. The will is fixed upon God by a vague love and a secret instinct, as indefinite as the thought just mentioned, by a dolorous and persistent need of a more intimate union with him. It is, as it were, a longing, like homesickness, after God absent, an unassuaged thirst, which cannot do without him. The soul would like to be inflamed with divine love, and, above all, to possess God. Merely to love him no longer satisfies her. She aspires to union with him. If she has had no experience of the state of quiet, this is a confused attraction, a dull need, an undefinable discomfort. If she has already tasted mystical union, it is a definite desire to return to this union. In order to reach this happy goal, the soul ends by abandoning her former exercises. She feels that they would not suffice for her object, and that road is now closed for her. Part 2. Explanation of this state. The 3 elements just described are easily discovered when this dryness has already lasted a long time. They characterize the passive purification of the senses and form its whole essence. This state is, at bottom, a state of contemplation, as yet too feeble a state of quietude in process of formation, a dry and purgative contemplation, as may be easily proved by the process of reasoning. This state is not tepidity. Tepidity, in fact, has no thirst for God, and willingly seeks its satisfaction outside of him. This purifying aridity, on the contrary, wishes for him only, and all its fears is the fear of offending him. All its desire only to serve him better. All its regret, that of not being sufficiently faithful to him. Neither does it proceed from melancholy, which paints everything in the darkest colors. Melancholy takes away our zeal in seeking God, allows disgust to invade the will, which becomes limp and languishing. This purging aridity, on the contrary, affects the central sensible feelings only. The will may have some weakness, and the soul, feeling nothing, is inclined to think that she is doing nothing. She acts, nevertheless, and remains generous, for, in spite of it all costs her, she never ceases seeking God by prayer and progress in virtue. Neither does this state come from physical indisposition or intellectual fatigue, for if it did, the dryness and powerlessness of the mind would make themselves felt elsewhere than in time of prayer. They would come and depart along with the malady, whereas this trial may last for years. Melancholy, indisposition, fatigue, and other natural causes may serve to purify the soul, but they are far from sufficing to explain this state. We must admit in it a more special action of God. According to St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa, the soul ceases to meditate, because discursive prayers have given her all it had to give. Henceforth, there will be for her no pleasure and little profit in it. Finding God by a more simple means, she no longer feels the need of reasoning. She would like to be always occupied only in loving, without giving a thought to anything else. These reasons would appear a sufficient explanation in the case when the soul feels herself inundated with light and love in a contemplation full of relish. But when this purging aridity makes her cruelly suffer, she would experience a great relief, and think she was making great progress, if she could arrive at making use of meditation in order to inflame her desolate heart. It is not, however, the desire to do so that is wanting, but the power. We prefer the explanation which John of the Cross gives elsewhere. Our Lord no longer communicates himself to the soul by helping her to meditate. The state of contemplation has commenced. The divine communications follow the way of the pure spirit, a way inaccessible to the senses. He withdraws his former aid and gives a new one. 1. He withdraws the former consolations in order to humble the soul by the sense of her powerlessness, to detach her from sweetnesses, to purge her thoroughly, to remove thus the obstacles to the grace he destines for her. Above all, the divine grace no longer favors meditation, because God's intentions are that the soul should enter upon another way. Deprived of the divine concurrence, the imagination and memory cease to furnish images and recollections, and the mind has no materials to work with. Hence, the source of meditation is dried up. God wishes to accustom the soul, through necessity, to receive her light from himself, instead of her procuring it by the force of reasoning, and to abandon the toil and turmoil of considerations for the simple look of contemplation. This afflicting withdrawal of help is altogether an act of mercy. God takes away an inferior good only in order to confer upon the soul a higher grace. 2. He begins to pour into the soul that loving knowledge which is the groundwork of contemplation. St. John of the Cross repeats, in 100 different forms, that this is a beginning of contemplation, dry and obscure to the senses, concealed and hidden, generally speaking, even from the soul herself. The mind, depending too much upon sense, has not as yet learned to appreciate this altogether spiritual manna. This grace, as yet powerless to make a vivid impression on the soul, and to throw her into transports of inebriating joy, is nevertheless real and of great price. It alone it is which detaches the soul from everything created, and keeps her turned towards God by a constant remembrance and a sore need of him. It is not as yet strong enough to crown all her desires, but it nourishes, strengthens, and is not without its charm. Passive purgation of the senses is, therefore, not a mere disposition for infused contemplation, it is the entrance into it and the commencement of it. Purgative contemplation and consoling contemplation are only one and the same divine fire. Weak at first, but destined to increase, it finds the soul like to the green wood full of sap, and it has to prepare it by drying it up, but that it may afterwards burst forth into a bright and burning flame. This is no longer the prayer of simplicity. If formerly I confined myself to forming affections, and made them short, and with little variety, that was by my own free choice. At most I only experienced a certain difficulty in doing otherwise, and could conquer it. Now, however, a certain passiveness has commenced. Passive is this inability to meditate, which is only just appearing, but will become more and more marked. Passive, this obscure and confused remembrance, this afflicting need of God. Passive, this desolating dryness in spite of fervor of spirit. Passive, this state of prayer, in which I have now no longer the same liberty to choose my subject and my method. Nevertheless, I can still produce a crowd of acts, like those of the mental prayer of simplicity, and I feel at times a need of doing so in order not to remain altogether idle. Here, then, we have a mixture of activity and passiveness. We have one foot in effective prayer, while the other is already planted in the dry region of the prayer of quietude. Part 3. Sufferings of this state. we must not exaggerate them. Authors have mainly depicted what took place in the souls of certain saints. God, who wished to raise them up to lofty heights, made them strong and did not spare them. He lavished upon them, as upon his dearest friends, a superabundance of his crosses. We are weak. God will proportion the burden to our weakness, or will increase our strength to bear it. Many persons in every condition of life endure sufferings as great as these first passive purgations, yet no one thinks of compassionating them. These pains, besides, lose their bitterness once the soul has come to value them and to submit herself to them with a resolute will. Nevertheless, they are real. Saint Teresa, who had experienced them during a number of years, declares that they are very great, and that, in her opinion, more courage is required to support them than to endure many worldly afflictions. But, as she clearly saw, God recompenses them, even in this life, with a magnificent reward. The soul suffers on account of the good things she has lost. It was not thus she used to pray formerly. Pious thoughts abounded. Affections welled up as from a fountain. She used to feel what she was saying to God. God used to show himself all-loving, and was prodigal in his caresses. She could have spent nights and days in prayer. Penances had a charm for her. Nothing would have cost her anything in the service of so good a master. Can it be that he is now angry with her? He has veiled the sun of his divine favors, closed the sluice gates of the spiritual waters, and deposited the soul upon the ground. He has weaned her, and would seem about to let her die of hunger. What bitter regrets! Her former practices are powerless to reanimate her fervor. The more recourse she has to them, the more her trouble and aridity augment. She suffers from this persistent dryness, on the side of God, who says nothing to her, and her prayer is full of weariness and ennui. On the side of creatures, for God makes them for her objects of disgust by imparting to them a special bitterness, or else in order to resist their seductions, she has to do herself a violence which her dryness renders all the more painful, and that, too, without any compensation. She suffers from all her surroundings. A mere nothing is to her a burden. She suffers from herself. She feels herself to be powerless, stupid, cold, entirely useless, with a tendency to evil, with no impulse towards good, a veritable load even for herself. She suffers from her inability to meditate, whence comes it that the imagination and the memory are devoid of pious memories, holy images, and abound in distractions. And may not this emptiness of mind be nothing but idleness, loss of time, culpable inaction, a punishment only too well deserved? And, even after the soul has come to understand better the divine meaning of this trial, her interior powers, deprived of their natural occupations, grow weary of having to practice renunciation without end, at least so long as they are only partially occupied by God. The soul suffers from the light that God is giving her. She has not yet understood that this obscure, confused, and altogether spiritual knowledge is a most precious gift, which later on God need only increase to throw her into transports of spiritual joy. The more simple this light is, the greater the risk of it passing away unperceived. It is at times so subtle and delicate, particularly when it is most pure, simple, perfect, spiritual, and interior, that a soul may very easily be possessed of it, and yet neither perceive nor feel that she has it. Moreover, this general and unvarying remembrance is monotonous in the extreme. The soul suffers also from that confused sense of need, from that indistinct love, which inclines her towards God, but at first causes her an undefinable uneasiness. The spiritual palate has not as yet learned to relish this new, delicate, and spiritual aliment. The heavenly manna has not made her forget the onions of Egypt, all the more because God gives it sparingly in the commencement. The soul hungers after God with a hunger that cannot be satisfied. When she thinks she has laid hold on him, he escapes from her. Feast days are for her like ordinary days, long days without light and without food. If she has already tasted God in the state of quiet, her desires become more lively, at times even anxious and very painful. But she lives upon memory and hope. God has come before. God will come again. The very ardor of this desire is a wound and a balm. A wound because this desire is unsatisfied, a balm because it proves that she loves and is beloved. On the contrary, when the soul has not yet tasted God, if this desire is less lively, it is also more afflicting, for the soul, feeling herself empty and cold, believes she is traveling towards perdition rather than towards mystical union. All these sufferings which the night of the senses causes in spiritual persons are very little when compared with the fears they awaken. It seems to them, in fact, that spiritual goods are lost to them forever, and that God has abandoned them. Profoundly wearisome, even when of short duration, this state may be prolonged for years. The soul sees nothing before her but an endless desert, which is monotonous, bleak, desolate, and dreadful. She would be very soon discouraged, did she not know whither it leads. These various pains belong to the very substance itself of the passive purgation. They are, as it were, the natural consequences of this dry kind of contemplation. But mingled with these pains there are often violent temptations, maladies, and other trials, which, without being a necessary and characteristic feature of it, complete the passive purgation of the soul. Trials of temptations. These are fierce assaults against faith. The soul tells herself that she no longer has any belief because she feels none. Against hope, she fears that God has abandoned her because he no longer consoles her. Against the holy virtue, Her disordered senses and imagination subject her to a torment worse than death itself. Against patience, in the midst of so many worries, the demon arouses in us so much anger and ill humor that everyone becomes insupportable to us, and that in spite of ourselves. We are inclined to murmur against our trials, to be sullen towards God, even to doubt his justice and his providence. Against Christian fortitude, shall we persevere? There are so many sacrifices to be made. Then weariness and disgust enervate the soul and dispose it to abandon the ways of prayer. Temptations to diabolical wickedness, execrable blasphemies seize upon the imagination. They are so strong and vivid that we almost believe we have uttered them. Temptations to scruples, so many doubts confound the mind, that the soul can neither solve them herself nor remedy them by blind obedience. The horrible torments of this spirit of unrest form, as it were, the transitional phase between the night of the senses and the night of the spirit. These temptations, and others like them, may be in every respect similar to those of the common ways of prayer. But, in this state, they press more heavily upon the soul, because they are superadded to the pains of aridity, and, at times, to that great dryness, which, even the remembrance of God is in some sort lost. When the soul has made more progress, these temptations may present themselves with such violence, suddenness, persistence, that it will be impossible not to recognize therein a special permission of God, and a kind of obsession. Who does not know of the fierce assaults made upon St. Anthony, St. Catherine of Siena, and Blessed Angela of Foligno? After enduring this sort of persecution for 5 years, St. Magdalene of Patsy, unable to suffer them any longer, was upon the point of yielding to despair and committing suicide. St. Teresa, during her 8 days, a fortnight, and even at times for 3 weeks, had her mind filled with 1,000 foolish thoughts without being able to think of anything good. It seemed to her that the demons were playing with her, as with a ball, some without her being able to escape from their blows. Trials on the part of men. God permits that those whom he has charged with our direction do not understand us, or that they should be unable to console us. They have doubts about everything, apprehend all kinds of evils, or imagine that the souls to whom God grants the graces of prayer ought to be angels. St. Teresa's confessors plunged her, for a length of time, into intolerable anxiety. Father Balthazar Alvarez, her director, had himself to endure a kind of persecution on account of his manner of prayer. But if we are to credit St. Teresa and St. Peter of Alcantara, one of the greatest sufferings in this state of exile is the opposition our spiritual progress meets with from really good people. Trials of sickness and infirmities. God has subjected the greater number of contemplative saints to these trials. Let us mention only St. Clare, St. Lidwina, and St. Teresa. It is not necessary that these trials should have a clearly supernatural character. When Saint Teresa had to endure her great spiritual pains, and, at the same time, the miseries of sickness, she underwent a real martyrdom. Add to all this fatiguing duties, the cares of a position fertile in preoccupations, failures, which inexplicably overwhelm us from all sides, and which, by God's will, occur just at the most trying moments, loss of property and of honors, and 1,000 other crosses which Providence may send. Sometimes these troubles have nothing extraordinary about them. Sometimes they are manifestly due to the special intervention. They are manifestly due to the special intervention of God. But in all cases these trials, while remaining only accessory means with regard to passive purgation, are none the less very efficacious in perfecting it, by detaching the soul from all things, and almost compelling her, in sheer desperation, to throw herself into the arms of God. We must not, however, think that every soul called to divine union must of necessity pass through all these accessory trials. God distributes more of them to some, less to others, according as the soul has more or less need of purification, and is destined to ascend to a more or less elevated state. Part 4. Advantages of this state. Let these poor suffering ones beware of believing that they are abandoned, and upon the very brink of the abyss. The way in which they are walking is really a very excellent way. It purifies them. It endows them with the most solid virtues. It is the desert which leads to the promised land. 1. With good reason, in this state, called a purgation, for it purifies our souls from pride. Inebriated with divine consolations, they used to deem themselves good. Plunged into a universal disgust, powerless to meditate, reduced to the production of a few meager affections without variety or unction, assailed often by the most humiliating temptations. They feel their misery, are convinced by force of evidence that they are worth very little, and that without God they can do nothing. They are, in consequence, disposed to make themselves very small in the presence of so much greatness and sanctity, to have a greater respect for his majesty, and to pray to him with more humility. As they find themselves plunged in darkness, they more willingly have recourse to the wisdom of their superiors, and become simple and docile. They are also too much occupied and penetrated with the sense of their own miseries to observe those of others with a malignant curiosity. Thus indulgence towards the fault of others, mutual forbearance, esteem and charity increase along with humility. This state also purifies souls from spiritual gluttony and all inordinate love of spiritual joys. The soul was greedy of consolations. She wished to find her pleasure in the service of God. Now, this inordinate love of spiritual pleasures dies for want of food. As time goes on, she learns to do without emotions, to give herself to God without any selfish interest, to serve him at her own expense, and no matter what it costs, the animal part is weakened by being deprived of sensible sweetness, the passions lose their force, and are reduced to order. Little by little she dies to herself, and the divine life meets with fewer hindrances. The soul gradually learns to work after a more spiritual fashion, and to depend less upon the senses. She abandons the coarser efforts of the imagination, the encumbrance and fatigue of reasoning, and begins to contemplate God by her superior part in an almost angelic way, just as she perceives evident truths by a most simple act. By this very fact that she is more free from sensuality and sensible feeling, the soul gives less hold to the demon, who acts chiefly on the imagination and the senses, and her prayer is more sheltered from illusions. 2. This purgation endows the soul with the most solid virtues. Besides humility and self-denial, which, by purifying her, remove the obstacles to progress, all the other virtues gain, in this state, a more pure merit and an immense increase. This is the case with regard to faith, for instance, for she believes in the midst of darkness without seeing or relishing anything upon the sole word of God. So, too, hope is strengthened. She trusts in the Lord, even whilst he leaves her and gives no longer any sign of his goodness. Charity, obedience, and religion develop. She sacrifices herself, prays, obeys through pure love, and not for the sake of any pleasure she finds therein. These trials are preeminently the soil most proper for the growth of patience, abnegation, and especially of a trustful, filial, and loving abandonment into the hands of God. Little by little the soul, humbled, detached from everything, but submissive, generous, and confiding, learns to become meek towards all, towards herself, so as no longer to be angry with herself on account of her faults, towards her neighbor, for the sight of his own miseries makes her compassionate to the ills of others, towards God, for having come to understand that he treats her better than she deserves, she becomes less importunate in seeking divine favors and less sullen when God chastises her. In proportion as she is purified and is enriched by virtues, she becomes peaceful and enters into a state of great repose. The divine consolations and caresses hide from her her misery and the infinite distance which separates her from God. She finds, in the midst of the darkness, a purifying light, which imparts to her a correct knowledge of God and of herself, a light already great, but which will grow greater still in the state of spiritual purgation. Finally, the soul learns to keep God continually in remembrance, and to have a great fear of backsliding in the spiritual way. All the soul's virtues develop and ripen in time, provided that she is generous enough to avoid tepidity and discouragement. To the soul herself her virtues appear a mere nothing, so dry and meagre they seem to be. But they are, on that account, all the better safeguarded, and are extremely pleasing to God, who knows what disinterested and persevering efforts they have cost. 3. This aridity is the desert which leads to the promised land. God weans the soul, removes the swaddling clothes of infancy, and sets her down that she may walk by herself. He deprives her of infant's food in order to give her the bread of the strong, a bread suitable to nourish the spirit, when, amidst dryness and darkness, it is devoid of sensible devotion. A bread, in fine, which is nothing else but infused contemplation. Such is the chief advantage which the soul gains, and which is the source of all the rest. The joy that, by occasion of all this, is felt in heaven now breaks forth in all its splendor. Part 5. Conduct to be observed. Two things are to be done: to accept trustfully the state in which God has placed us, and, in order to draw profit from it, to act with courage, both during prayer and in the practice of virtue. 1. To accept of this state trustfully. God withdraws his consolation and plunges us into a state of dryness and desolation. Let us first see whether we have provoked this trial by our faults, our attachments, our dissipation. If we have, the penalty is only just, and let us make it also salutary by accepting it and correcting ourselves. If our conscience does not reproach us with any fault, let us adore lovingly the will of God, who is a good Father and a wise director. Let us, without afflicting ourselves, put our confidence in him, who never forsakes those who seek him with a simple and upright heart. He is too wise a guide ever to lead us to our ruin. Without ever abandoning prayer, let us accept, even to the last sigh, this dryness and desolation, and let us not leave Jesus Christ to carry alone the burden of his cross. We are near our Master, and he is certainly nigh unto us. Sure of pleasing him, let us ambition no other satisfaction. Let him lead us by whatever path he pleases. We belong no longer to ourselves, but to him. True love does not consist in tears and sweetness. It is proved by serving our Lord with courage and humility. Trouble takes away liberty of spirit and the courage to undertake great things for God. And if, at other times, we were to feel ourselves powerless to do anything, in the shape of meditation during 1 hour, this state of trouble would make us feel so 4 times as much. This state furnishes an excellent occasion for exercising the spirit of faith, the hope of eternal goods, disinterested love, Christian fortitude, and all the other virtues. No virtue, perhaps, is more useful than a filial and loving abandonment of ourselves into God's hands. Let us be thoroughly convinced that dryness and desolation, the most dreadful temptations, the inability to meditate in this feeble germ of dry contemplation, all obey God and serve his merciful designs. One thing only is to be feared: our own want of confidence and docility. Our resistance is the only hindrance that can mar his bountiful designs. 2. We must persevere courageously in prayer. but without opposing the action of God. Let us not leave off meditation and effective prayer till God invites us to do so. That is, let us keep to them as long as they are possible for us, and do us more good, and this especially with regard to the life and passion of our Lord. If a book, a statue, or a pious picture could help us to excite affections and to fix our thoughts, let us make use of it, unless God is drawing us towards interior repose. At the times when passive purgation is interrupted, ordinary prayer becomes again possible, and we should return to it. Should God render us incapable of meditating, in order to pour into our soul that loving knowledge, which forms the groundwork of contemplation, let us embrace this state with all confidence. For this most simple attention to Him, this interior look fixed on God, these motions of love, of humility, and other like movements which carry the soul towards God, are not idle occupations. Our occupation, indeed, is not manifested by outward expressions and sentences, but it is nevertheless real, and God, who beholds the depths of the heart, understands this silent homage. Let us avoid at such a time everything that might obstruct the action of God. At such a moment let the soul cease from meditating. Besides, though she should wish to continue meditating, she would not be able to do so. Let her abstain also from seeking with attachment after sensible relish and fervor, and from making acts too multiplied or too complex. This would be to create an obstacle to the action of God, the principal agent, who is secretly and calmly pouring into it the soul a loving knowledge and wisdom. Let her then assume an almost passive attitude, keeping herself in a state of pure, simple, and loving attention, as one would do who opens the eyes merely to look with love upon one another. If God requires her for a time to make some special acts, let her be satisfied with making these to which God inclined her, without doing violence to herself in order to multiply them or to produce others. For the chief action here is that God, ours should be second this, even to cease from action altogether. However, as the soul is far from being lost in God, she must still fight against distractions, courageously keep her look and her heart lovingly turned towards God, carefully avoid idleness, such as that state of slothful inaction, in which the soul is no longer employed in looking and loving either by distinct acts or by loving attention. In spite of our dryness and disgust, let us have the patience and the courage to converse with God in the church and elsewhere, just the same as if He were giving us consolations. If the duration of these conversations with God should make them monotonous and distasteful, we can make them shorter and more frequent. But, in any case, let us not show any sullenness towards God. 3. For the purification of the soul and its advancement in virtues, this state is a golden mine which must be courageously utilized. There is a treasure to be gotten from it. Let us not stand with folded arms through fear of the cost. Let us apply ourselves with ardor and perseverance to enrich ourselves with the humility, abnegation, abandonment to God and other virtues which this state brings with it. If we meet with painful temptations, let us combat energetically. Our faculties are in bonds only when we are in prayer, and, even then, only with regard to two complex considerations and acts. We can always watch over ourselves, have recourse to God, and fight the good fight. Saint Teresa had more fear of a single venial sin than all of hell together. With a crucifix in her hand she would defy all the demons. She found them to be so full of cowardice that the very sight of her seemed to strike them with terror. The moment they are despised, they lose all courage. What gives them power is our wavering and our feebleness of our resistance. The saint could not understand those fears which make people say, the devil, when they could say, God, God, and thus make the infernal enemy tremble. God, for whom we combat, will sustain us. Temptation cannot cross the limit set to it by the divine good pleasure. It always has a providential purpose. It attacks us on our weak side, and obliges us to fortify that. It instructs us, spurs us on, crushes pride, excites to prayer, calls for austerities, and elicits great resolutions. Thus the demon becomes, in his own despite, one of the most active agents of our union with God. Amidst failures, contradictions, and other crosses sent by Providence, nothing hinders us from having recourse to God. How often all our trials vanish, as if by enchantment, at the moment appointed by the divine decrees. How often, also, the soul, strengthened anew by grace, hardly feels her sufferings, and offers herself to undergo fresh sacrifices. The most generous way to act is to conduct ourselves like a sick person under medical treatment, and to accept of the remedy, although bitter, and to conform ourselves exactly to the divine prescriptions. Should sickness and infirmities aggravate our sufferings, there is nothing to prevent us from having recourse to God and to our superiors, and obedience is a duty. We must not, however, give way to a burning anxiety to escape this trial, nor abuse it, in order to unduly diminish the burden of regular observance. A generous soul will receive a cross from God's hand with patience, humility, and abandonment. She will even take occasion from it to renew in herself the spirit of austerity. Father de Padronos said one day to Saint Teresa that perhaps God was sending her so many sicknesses only in order to exact from her a penance which she had failed to perform. The saint candidly admits that, since she began to treat herself with less care and delicacy, she enjoyed much better health. Let us renew in ourselves, if necessary, the esteem and love of suffering, and let us valiantly practice those austerities which are compatible with the state of our health. In this state of dryness, desolation, and overwhelming temptations, we stand more than ever in need of a spiritual guide, from whom nothing, neither the bad nor the good that is in us, should be hidden, in order that we may be securely directed encouraged and sustained. Woe to the presumptuous soul who dares to be her own sole guide. God grant that the director may also know the road by his own experience, at least that he may be learned. The most enlightened will be the best, as St. Teresa says. Our Lord always required from the saint obedience to her confessor. Part 6. Duration of these trials. The purgation of the senses, with its accompanying pains and temptations, lasts a longer or a shorter time. But how long the soul will continue in this state no one can with certainty tell. This varies according to the divine will, and is proportioned to the imperfections, many or few, which are to be purged away, and also to the degree of union in love to which God intends to elevate a particular soul, to the nature of itself, of the suffering she must undergo, and finally to the fidelity of her correspondence with God's action. Those who are endowed with a capacity to suffer, and who have strength sufficient to endure, God purifies in more intense trials and in less time. But those who are weak are purified more slowly and with consideration for their weakness. In the case of certain souls, the inability to meditate and the dryness are continual. With others, the mind at times resumes its liberty, and God grants them some consolations, lest they should lose courage and fall away. These latter seem to have only one foot in this night, and also they come late to the pureness of their perfection in this life, and some of them never reach it here below. As to souls still weaker, God tries them by showing himself to them and again hiding himself from them, in order to make them seek after him. He does not use the same precautions in regard to strong souls, whom he wants to raise to the union of love. Still, however quickly God may lead them, experience shows that they are wont to remain a long time in this state of sensitive purgation. Generally speaking, it lasts a certain number of years. The first night is the germ and the bud of passive prayer. However, certain persons have to endure this trial later on, as St. Teresa says. With time, the state of quiet becomes more marked, and the inability of the mind to meditate goes on ever increasing. But, at the moment the soul least thinks of it, God makes her feel a most spiritual sweetness, and communicates to her a most pure love and a most delicate spiritual knowledge. She passes then through an alternating succession of ardent prayer, whereby love is wonderfully developed, and of progressive aridity, whereby the soul is ever more and more purified, whilst the longing for God, having become more intense, singularly dilates her capacity of loving and receiving him. This purgation pursues its course in this way through the primary stages of contemplation. If it is God's good pleasure, and the soul is generous, this state, after a period of repose, is commonly quitted only to enter into the night of the spirit, which is more difficult and grievous, and by no means of it, to advance towards the perfect union of love, but it is only a very small number who arrive there. Is it a duty to pray for the end of these trials, on the pretext that they are a sort of ailment, and that, being called to contemplation, we should hasten to enter into it? We do not think so. 1. This arid contemplation is a remedy and not an evil. The wounds to be healed are pride, spiritual gluttony, and too great dependence of the superior faculties upon the senses. Seeing that the soul continues on her way to be purified in the fire of mystical union, it is necessary that she should enter upon this passive purgation and stay a long time in the bitterness of this first night. We know whither it is leading us. Are we not all the more free when we abandon ourselves courageously into God's hands and leave everything to the heavenly physician, who knows better than we do the remedy, the dose, and the time it requires? 2. We ought to make haste to enter into the state of contemplation. No doubt. But this is already done, since it is the self-same contemplation which is now purging the soul before setting it on fire. It will be developed in the same proportion as this purgation shall have better prepared the soul for union. The more God plows and harrows the soul, the better chance the precious seed has of living and of producing flowers and fruit. As, however, God's ulterior designs are concealed from us, it is quite permissible to pray for an end of these trials, provided it be with submission and purity of intention. But, in our opinion, it would be much better to leave God to act according to his pleasure, and to ask him only for generosity and patience. This seems to us the wisest and most valiant way to show our good will and to seek for progress. Article 2. Passive Purgation of the Spirit. Part 1. When it takes place and what it is. St. John of the Cross teaches that, between the nights of the senses and that of the spirit, God grants long years of repose, during which a much relished contemplation is developed in the exercises of the progressive way. The spiritual part, thanks to its first purgation, walks onward untrammeled. It is no longer attached to consolations. Its powers are no longer entangled in the chains of reasoning. The spirit soon reposes with ease in a serene and loving contemplation, accompanied with spiritual relish. As the purification of the soul, after the night of the senses only, is yet far from being complete, this state of transition does not exclude aridities, darkness, and anguish. At times these are even more intense than during the purification of the senses, but they are less prolonged. After some days of these storms, serenity returns to the soul with its wonted joys. The senses, now purified, begin to share in the joys of the spirit, but are as yet too weak to support the intensity of the divine communications. Hence it comes that, even in this intermediate time, ecstasies, raptures, and even strange physical phenomena may happen, all which will no longer take place after the night of the spirit. For then the senses and the spirit, being freer, stronger, and purer, will be able to sustain the action of God without giving way. This passive purgation of the spirit never precedes that of the senses, rarely accompanies it, but, generally speaking, follows it after an intermediate period of repose. Yet God remains always master of his own action in time. He is not bound to follow any invariable course. In spite of the purgation of the senses, there still remains in the spirit some habitual imperfections. These are defective affections and dispositions, which that first night has been unable to uproot, because they have their roots in the spirit. There is, moreover, a sort of spiritual stupidity, which renders the spirit subject to distractions and effusiveness. There remains also actual imperfections, pride, for instance, which insinuates itself into everything that wears an appearance of holiness, such as ecstasies, visions, and revelations. A certain boldness and want of respect in God's regard, a too great greed of spiritual sweetness. The manner and operations of the soul are still on a low level. She thinks of the things of God like a child. She speaks of God like a child. Her acts and sentiments are the acts and sentiments of a child. On account of the infinite union of the sensitive with the intellectual part of the soul, neither of them can be perfectly purified without the other. The purgation of the senses prepares the soul to endure that of the spirit, which in its turn completes that of the senses. The night of the senses is rather a reformation than a purgation properly so called. The night of the spirit proceeds even to the plucking up of the root of the evil. The former is painful, the latter terrible. Both are a purifying aridity which, remotely or approximately, leads on to the perfect union of love. The one is wrought out in the sensible part of the soul, the other in the intelligence and the will. Each is brought about by a special operation of God, which is none other than obscure contemplation itself in certain conditions. It is easy to conceive that this divine influence first penetrates the exterior and interior senses before entering into the superior and more inward faculties. In the beginning, contemplation was too feeble, and the soul was suffering from not enjoying God. Now it will be too strong, and it is its very strength which afflicts the soul in diverse ways. In short, the night of the Spirit is a mysterious influence which God exerts by means of a vigorous but obscure contemplation upon the superior faculties, in order to purify them, and thus to prepare them for the perfect union of love. Part 2. Sufferings of this state. 1. God withdraws from the soul the relish and feeling of spiritual things which it used to experience. The first state of aridity has dried up sensible devotion and the sweetness of meditation. This takes away accidental spiritual devotion and the sweets of contemplation. The soul retains a prompt and generous will to serve God in every way, but she is plunged into darkness and dryness. 2. God communicates to the soul such vivid lights that, unable to bear their strength and impetuosity, she is dazzled and pained by them. The senses and the spirit suffer, as though they were oppressed by an immense weight, and are plunged in a cruel agony. Just so the pure and vivid brightness of the sun dazzles and afflicts eyes that are sore. The light of contemplation, much stronger now than formerly, trammels still more our natural operations. The memory is more devoid of every remembrance, and that has not reference to God. The intellect experiences a more profound incompatibility. The will and the senses are plunged in a more complete aridity. 3. A horrible suffering, which St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa have described in a thrilling fashion, comes from the fact that this contemplation brings the most vivid light, God's infinite greatness, and our own nothingness. His holiness and our sinfulness, it is, in fact, an only too evidently infused knowledge of God and of ourselves. The poor soul is seized with trembling in the presence of so lofty a majesty. She is terrified at her own hideous deformity and numberless offenses. Whatever good she has done is hidden from her. The divine graces given her stand out in strong contrast with her sins. A terrible anguish crushes her in the presence of God's holiness and justice. She believes herself to be all mud and filth, devoid of every virtue. It seems to her impossible that God could love so horrible an object or endure such infection. Besides, was she ever worth anything? Has she not lived under a perpetual delusion? Is she then not justly abandoned, hopelessly lost? She wishes only for God, but God seems to take away from her forever, and she is drowning in an ocean of bitterness, horribly tempted against hope. This, however, is but the vivid thrill of adoration. It is regret, shame, desire in love, not falling away, not backsliding down the slope of negligence. For this soul fears the least fault more than death. She so loves God that she would sacrifice 1,000 lives for his sake. In this dreadful storm, faith has not foundered. The despair is only apparent. It has its seat only in the sensitive nature. It is the love of God and the fear of losing him which subjects the soul to such a torture, and this alone should be sufficient to reassure her. But God permits that no one is able to give her any lasting consolation. She is herself reduced to a state of utter helplessness. Mental prayer is, as it were, impossible to her. Vocal prayer and spiritual reading have no meaning for her. She finds everywhere 1,000 subjects of affliction, nowhere anything to reassure her. For souls in this state there remains no other resource than to hope against all hope, to throw themselves with an entire abandonment into the arms of God. Saint Teresa advises that in such a time the soul should create a diversion by employing herself in pious occupations. The heat of these pains is felt only from time to time and not continuously. Otherwise it would cause death. The assaults which Saint Teresa herself endured lasted 8 days, 15 days, or even 3 weeks. During this time the sufferer believes they will never end, but God dispels them, and then it seems as if there had never been a cloud in the soul. When the union is to be serious and real, this night, however generous the soul may be, lasts for several years. With the above-mentioned alternatives of storm and calm, the suffering is sometimes so violent that the soul seems to see the abyss open at her feet and ready to engulf its victim. This state is a hell in its pain, a purgatory in its purifying power. St. John of the Cross affirms that these souls shall not pass through the fire of the next world, or at least shall not remain long therein. Unknown to themselves, they are now being purified even to their utmost depths, and the spiritual marriage is the goal at which these terrible trials terminate. 4. St. John of the Cross, and, in a more special way, St. Teresa, describe another passive purgation, which is worked out on the tortures of love. There is no question here that those alternating states familiar to contemplatives, wherein God casts the soul into transports by manifesting himself, and again plunges it into anxious desires by hiding himself. For the trials here spoken of are very special, crucifying and sublime. Previous to the period of her great raptures, St. Teresa had during some years very frequently received the wound of love. The soul feels that God is near her, and that he is calling her. Fired, transported, desperate with love, she almost dies through her desire of seeing him, and, not being able to possess him at her ease here below, she is dying on account of not being able to die. She conceives a horror for the world and her wretched body. She is rudely tormented between the excess of her transports and that of her powerlessness. It is as though a sharp-pointed arrow inflicted a deep wound upon the soul, and made it suffer a real martyrdom, and at times the body is almost deprived of feeling. This torture is so intense that the sufferer cannot help uttering groans, and at the same time so delightful that the soul would never wish it to cease. It lasts rather long sometimes, now diminishing, now increasing, at other times rather a short while, either because this flame becomes extinct, or because it all ends in a rapture. God completed the purgation of St. Teresa's soul by a species of suffering still more painful and more spiritual than the preceding. In the wound of love, the body shared in the suffering and also in the sweetness. Here, it is admitted to a share of the suffering, but not of the enjoyment. The soul alone tastes the delight of this new kind of martyrdom. In the former case, God made himself felt to be quite near. The soul understood that he was calling her. In the latter, he shows himself at a great distance. There, the soul transported with love, seized with a violent desire of beholding God, was almost dying because she could not die. Here she experiences the same impatient and torturing hunger, but with this peculiar character that, seeking after God and finding him nowhere, she feels herself to be in a boundless desert, crucified between heaven, which she does not yet possess, and earth, which is no longer anything to her. God communicates to the soul a most vivid knowledge of his amiable qualities, and this light sharpens her desires and her torment. The pain is so great that the body is tortured by it. But of this the soul has no perception at the moment. So much more poignant is this wound of the spirit. It is a martyrdom of pains and of joys, a martyrdom which terrifies nature, but out of which the soul would never wish to issue, because she knows its charm and its value. It is of comparatively short duration, not lasting more than a few hours. In it, life itself runs a real risk, both on account of the extreme pains which accompany it and the violent rapture which it terminates. Happily, the victims who this divine affliction torments, alas, dare we say that we ever have loved God? This holy violence tears the soul away from everything created. The great fear, which she experiences at the sight of her miseries, extirpates the last roots of pride. The crucible of divine love completes the destruction of everything human that remained in her. Her faculties, reduced to a more thorough emptiness, have become supple and docile to receive the action of God. Henceforth the soul is purified, disciplined, illuminated, inflamed. She is ready for perfect union with God. To sum up, it is contemplation itself, which at one time darkens, dries up, tortures and purifies souls, at another sheds over them a pure light and inundates them with a love full of sweetness. It produces different effects according to the various dispositions of the soul. The same fire produces at once a clear and burning flame, if the wood is dry. But it begins by blackening, drying, and preparing the green wood, before enveloping it in a pure and delightful blaze. This depends also upon the will of God, who, ever wise and merciful, communicates to contemplation an activity, sometimes purgative, sometimes enlightening and inflaming. He knows how to make Tabor succeed to Calvary, to humble and annihilate the soul by crucifying it, to fortify and prepare it for fresh trials by manifesting himself. In the sweetness of these meetings with God, past agonies are dispelled like a dream and forgotten. Yet the soul feels, as it were instinctively, that Calvary still awaits her, because she has not completely died to herself, for these trials will entirely cease only when the fire of contemplation finds nothing more to purify and the faculties are well disciplined. If the divine action is strong and the soul docile, the trial will be less prolonged. Let the soul submit to it with courage and not complain. For the rigor and duration of these mysterious pains are the announcement of and preparation for the more sublime accents and faith in perfection. Is there any need to observe that the passive purgation of the senses marks the first step in mystical ways, and that of the spirit leads on to the summit? Both, however, belong to the same order of ideas and form a complete whole. This is the reason why we thought it best to explain both of them together, although, generally speaking, the passive purgation of the spirit does not take place for a long time after most of these states of prayer, which remain for us now to describe.